All right, so I am going to do a little lecture so we can knock out. Remember, you have a quiz tomorrow based off of chapter 27. We covered some civil rights stuff, we covered some foreign policy. Now let's focus a little bit more. Okay, so let me go back. I'm ahead of the game. We are now going to letter D, where it's talking about the Soviet Union. Okay, so there's something that's going to change things. Okay. Also, just note if you ever see Atoms for Peace, that is where basically Eisenhower's doing a presentation at the United Nations. How, like, he's worried that, we're just building up our nuclear weapons and so are other places in the world. And it's like, hey, let's like chill on like the nuclear weapon part, and maybe we can like just focus on peace. Okay. Where it's like, look, like, let's just use this stuff for peace, but it didn't really do much. Just associate Eisenhower with Atoms for Peace. Okay. Next, we have the space race. Okay. So the world is shocked when the Soviets launch Sputnik. Well, what is Sputnik? It is an artificial satellite, and it's about the size of a basketball, and it orbited the Earth successfully. Okay. So, dang it, the Soviets beat us. We feel like we are just way behind. We have failed America. Okay. And so it's the size of a basketball, and we are embarrassed again. We feel like we are just way behind. This freaks us out because, again, if you have satellites, well, what can satellites do? Direct GPS coordinates. We're not talking, Enola Gay dropping a bomb. We're talking like exact locations with a satellite. What else could the Soviets do? Okay. So what's going to happen is we will rush and we will come up with something called Vanguard. Okay. And I believe that's the blank Vanguard, Vanguard. And everybody was on TV. It was live. And it was like, we're going to watch Vanguard. Because again, this is our reaction to Sputnik. Okay. Our artificial satellite. Okay. It launches, it goes up just a few feet, and then it crashes. Okay. And this is even worse now because here we are attempting to compete with the Soviets, and it's a huge failure. Some people even refer to it as like Flopnik or stay putnik, like stay put. So yeah, we feel so bad. So we got to change some things. But just note that Sputnik in 1957, during Eisenhower's presidency, starts what we call the space race. Okay. So for instance, the Soviets go, to space first. Well, then a year later, we got to go to space, that kind of thing. There's competitions. Who can send the first monkey to space, the first dog to space? Okay. So there's all these things, and it starts with Sputnik. Okay, so let's talk about one product or result effect of this Sputnik. Remember, I told you America feels behind. And so Congress in 1958 will pass the National Defense and Education Act, the NDEA. And what it did is it really stepped up what you call your STEM stuff today, your math, your science, even some foreign languages, engineering courses, that kind of stuff. It's the idea that, we need to focus on those classes because those are the type of subjects that would increase our chances of space exploration. It's all about competing with the Soviets. I do like this cartoon. It says reading, writing, arithmetic. It's about, now it's going to be about science, Sputnik, and space. Okay. The other stuff isn't too important. The NDEA is super important, though. Like I said, the math and science standards are going to be higher. Sometimes they even pay teachers more because they're teaching those more demanded, courses. Okay. During this time. Another product or effect of the launch of Sputnik will be in 1958, NASA will be established. NASA stands for National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Okay. And this is an independent federal agency about exploring space. Okay. So again, we're behind. What do we got to do? Create NASA. Okay. And you can see it's kind of hard to see, but there's lots and lots of things we do. So like Project Mercury is the first time that we send a human into space. This is after the Soviets. Then you have Project Gemini, which we are about sending humans into space, also with like an extra vehicular, it's like automobile, I believe, or something was like an extra, something other than just space, like a person in space. And then you have Project Apollo, which you can't see right now, but that's more about lunar exploration. Okay. Just want to point this out okay, so hold on very quickly. Create NASA, National Defense and Education Act. Okay. Also want to point out, there is a Cuban Revolution. Remember, Cuba's 90 miles south of Miami, Florida, or no, Key West, Florida, my bad. And it's took place from 1953 to 1959. In 1959, okay, Batista, the Cuban leader, is overthrown by Fidel Castro, okay, with the help of Che Guevara. Okay. And like, we are not okay with this because it's so close to us. And so we will initiate trade embargoes. Think of it as like economic sanctions of us not agreeing with, communism taking over Cuba that's so close to us. Okay. Also, so a year later in 1960, okay, this is called the U-2 incident. What is a U-2? It is a spy plane that can go really high altitude spy plane. Okay. Just so you know, we were going to meet with Khrushchev at Camp David, which is in Maryland. It's a retreat for the president. And they were going to talk about I guess coexisting more and decreasing tension and stuff. Well, guess what? This incident screws it all up. Okay. What happens is the Soviets shoot down a U-2 spy plane, and they'll get the pilot, who is Francis Gary Powers, which is interesting fact. I'm pretty sure he married someone from Noonan. Who knew? And at first, Khrushchev's like, okay, Eisenhower, you got caught spying on us. And Eisenhower said, no, we were taking, we're collecting weather data. Okay. Well, then Khrushchev, he's already one step ahead of Eisenhower. He already has the film developed from the spy plane. And he says, well, look at all our missile, sites. That doesn't look like the weather to me. So, we got kind of caught with our hand in the cookie jar. And you can see how this summit got caught off. Okay. There will be a spy swap. There's a movie called Bridge of Spies that does a good job with this, but it's about exchanging like a Soviet spy in America for Francis Gary Powers. But do you see, it's like things are getting better, and then we get caught spying and it ruins everything. Okay. In 1956, it's Adlai Stevenson versus Eisenhower, and Eisenhower wins in a landslide. Okay. So people still like Ike. That was a little campaign thing. Okay. Don't worry about this. This was your bonus stuff from last night. Okay, so now let's talk about some cultural stuff of the 1950s. Okay, when you think of the 1950s, you tend to think about prosperity. Okay, we do have the highest standard of living in the world. Okay, and a couple of things like our purchasing power increased by 30%, meaning we have more money to purchase things with. Employment dropped down to 4.5%. That's super low. Okay, booming economy. 60% of families owned a home. 87% of families owned a TV. Based on the 1950s, it was like one TV for every 3.3 adults. So that's a lot. 75% of families owned a car, and every couple of years they get a new car. And then 60% of the population is now considered the middle class. Okay. So people who maybe tend to be more blue collar workers are now kind of making more money, and they get kind of associated with the white collar workers. Okay. So now let's talk about the affluent society. Okay, this is a professor, an economist named John Kenneth Galbraith. The affluent society. Affluent means wealthy. Okay, now again, when you think of the 1950s, you think of a lot of consumerism, a lot of wealth. However, his argument is that in the private sector, things are booming, but in the public sector, there's a lot of poverty. He believes that 22 to 25% of Americans are still below the poverty line. They cannot make ends meet. He basically believes that the government needs to invest more in public investment, like public schools and stuff, things provided by the government, and instead of just the private sector. So again, his argument is like the private sector, like companies, capitalism, booming, very affluent. But there are a lot of people who are still in poverty. And he argues that we need the government to kind of step up and really focus on public aspects to help people with poverty. Okay. Again, that middle class, 60% of people, in the middle class, that's huge. Consumerism, so big in the 1950s. I think of it like the 1920s and 1950s, very comparable with a lot of consumerism. The differences between the 1920s and 1950s, now you have the credit card in the 1950s. I believe the first credit card is the Diners Club, but now you have this piece of plastic where you're not just doing, store accounts, you're doing monthly installments, and it makes it easy just to swipe your credit card now instead of having to write down paper and keep track of stuff. Makes it easier to swipe and spend money, and consumerism. Okay. By 1957, it was nearly one per family. Okay. And the TV at this time is basically owned by three major networks. It was more like quiz shows, some, sitcoms, professional sports. Okay. You saw some of the clips like Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners. Those are all good. Westerns were really big in the 1950s. Okay. Also, movies and films are going to be big. So basically, it's the U.S. versus Paramount. And this is basically said that film studios are banned to own movie theater chains. So like, you see, it's like less of that monopoly feel. So now independent movie making can happen. And just note that there's lots of like aliens and monsters, like the creature from the Black Lagoon, kind of sci-fi stuff. But also in the 1950s, we'll talk about, there's a huge emphasis on Christianity and religion, and big epic movies by Cecil B. DeMille, the Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, these big religious epic blockbuster hits. Going to be like the top selling, movies of this time. That just shows you that religion's really big in the 1950s. You have James Dean right here with A Rebel Without a Cause. The idea of like this rebel, like juvenile delinquency is like, cool at this time. Okay. Lots of music. You have Billie Holiday with, Blue Moon. You have crooners like Frank Sinatra. You have doo-wop, which is kind of like a cappella. But the big thing is rock and roll. Rock and roll is a mix of like African-American blues and white country. Okay. And there's things like rockabilly and stuff. That's like the mixture before it becomes rock and roll. It's called rockabilly. And, it's crazy. Elvis Presley, for instance, he was, he got in trouble because they told him, do not dance like you do. It's called like gyrating. And so what the Ed Sullivan Show did is when they filmed him singing Hound Dog, they filmed him from the waist up because they knew the stuff that was happening below the camera was too vulgar for the 1950s. Okay. Also, the song that just got so many parents upset was Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock, because rock and roll, when this kind of started, rock and roll was kind of slang for, I guess, having sex. And so like, if you've heard the song before, it's like, we're going to rock around the clock tonight. Well, now it's like an innuendo, double meaning. See how parents are just freaking out. And it's like, when the clock strikes one, we're going to have some fun. See how rock and roll isn't like really is that, think 1920s tradition versus modernism. These parents are just thinking their children are not going to go to heaven. Okay. Pretty crazy stuff. Okay. Let's see. I Love Lucy. Next, just note computers in terms of companies will first be used in the 1950s. They're as big as like this classroom, and they were basically a glorified calculator. Okay. Government universities using them, not for personal use. Also, plastics will start to replace glass. It's a new industry. Chemicals, DDT. It's a chemical that's a pesticide. That's going to be really used to help farmers out during this time. We know later it's going to be really bad and cause a lot of cancer. You have cheap gas at this time. You have hotels and motels pop up like Holiday Inn or Days Inn and stuff like that. And then you have fast food like McDonald's that are going to pop up. Fads like hula hoops, silly putty, Barbie dolls are going to be big. Remember that consumerism, all that advertisement. Because now you don't have just radios, you have TVs too for even another whole level of marketing. Okay. So let's talk about suburban nation. Okay. We're going to skip down where it says the baby boom. Long story short, when soldiers are fighting World War II and they're dodging bullets, they realize that life is short. And when they get home from the war, they're going to find a girlfriend or marry their girlfriend and start a family and make up for lost time. Hence The baby boom. Okay. The baby boom is the largest population growth in U.S. history. More people were born during this time than any other time in U.S. history. 78.3 million Americans were born. Okay. 50 million of that amount, were in the 1950s. Okay. This is a game changer. Okay. Because, you have a family and think about all the things you need now. You might need a house now. Okay. Hold on one second. Okay, so let's see where we were. The announcements just came on. Okay, so think about this. When people are having babies, we're talking about lots of people having lots of babies, that impacts the economy. One is, again, you might need a house now. And let's say you want an affordable house. Well, you might leave to the suburbs then, so you can afford a bigger house. Another thing is, think about all these new industries that are just going to really just make bank and produce diapers, formula, okay, all these things people don't think about, but that really can change the economy for, in a good thing when people are having all these babies. And let's see, they tend to live comfortable because of that consumer culture that they will grow up with in the 1950s. Okay, so now let's talk about this. So the baby boom. Oh, and also another example of this baby boom, there is a book, I bet if you ask your parents, they know about it. It's called Dr. Benjamin Spock, and he wrote Baby and Child Care. And this is basically like the how-to to like raise a child. Like for me, when I had John, it was Moms on Calls, the book, and it was like my go-to. Well, during this time, and even when I was born, my parents did Baby and Child Care by Dr. Spock, and it's very like, it's a child's world and you're living in it. You should not punish your children. You should preach permissiveness, no spanking. Again, a woman's job is to devote every waking moment to their child's needs. Can you see how like that might lead to like the hippies of the 1960s? Okay, but that was like #1 bestseller in the 1950s, like baby and child care. Because again, so many people are having babies. Okay. So now let's talk about all these babies. You will have suburbia develop. Okay. Thanks to that, remember that GI Bill of Rights, you have these veterans who basically get down payments on their homes. You have the baby boom. So people might need a home now. Okay. Interstate highways makes it easier to live in the suburbs and work in the city. And then the Great Migration. What I mean by this as being a cause for suburbia is you'll have a good bit of people, unfortunately, who are going to leave the city because they can't afford to and move to the suburbs. And that's called white flight. Like they're getting away from a certain race and because they can, and they'll move to the suburbs. Okay. So in the suburbs, you tend to have single family homes. You start to have these subdivisions, and you'll have like shopping malls and chain stores all near it. Okay. Urban decay. So again, a lot of people are leaving and there's going to be more poverty up in the cities. Okay. So here's an example of this mass production Levittown's, suburbs. William Arthur Levitt, okay, will create Levittown. Okay. At first, this was for veterans because, again, you had the GI Bill of Rights. That's money. Okay. And so this is where you get like an assembly type cookie cutter home. Okay. These homes were prefabricated. So what does that mean? It's kind of like a dollhouse. Think of it like that, but it's like an actual house where like all these things are made in factories. And then you go to the lot you pay for, and then it's assembled just like a playhouse. Here's the example of mass production here. The fastest that a Levittown house was assembled, 16 minutes. So when I think of Levittown in the 1950s, I think of Henry Ford and mass production of his Model T. See the synthesis there? Okay. And again, because it's mass production, just like, remember, what color did the Model T come in? Only black, because it was about mass production to keep the cost down. Levittown, same thing. White house, basically gray or black, roof. It's about mass production to make the cost go down, to make it more affordable. Okay. What is interesting, and there's Levittown communities in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. And most of them, those houses are still around today. So that's pretty interesting. Okay. And again, remember I told you white flight, what's going to happen is a lot of people in the cities are going to leave because they can't afford to. And that's going to leave a lot of, African Americans in the cities because they need to be working close to their jobs. Okay. Just note the cult of domesticity is really big in the 1950s with the housewife and baby and childcare. We talked about consumerism with credit cards and shopping malls. Advertising is huge in the 1960s. Okay. Kool-Aid's going to be big. Ford's going to be big. Chef Boyardee is another big thing in the 1950s. Okay. So last thing we have, two things in the cult of domesticity. Okay. Remember, the consumerism, the advertisements, the TV shows definitely reinforce this cult of domesticity. The idea that women, should be the housewife. Okay. It's also something that was kind of a little term phrase that was big in the 1950s was the MRS degree, meaning like, for instance, like I have a bachelor's of arts. I have a BA degree. I have an MED, and I also have an EDS, which is a specialist degree. Okay. The joke was, and it still is kind of a joke today, but there are women in especially in the 1950s, they're like, you go to college not to earn your BA or, whatever. You earn your degree. Like you go to college so you can find a husband. Like there are a lot of women in the 1950s. And again, you go to college to find that husband, and it was dubbed, oh yeah, I'm getting my MRS degree. Okay. 40% of women did hold jobs. So, women are still working, but again, most women are in that cult of domesticity. So here's a nice little know your role thing I'm going to show you.
Harvey, want anything special for your birthday?
Just a decent cup of coffee.
You're kidding.
I'm serious. Honey, your coffee's undrinkable.
Pretty harsh.
Well, so's your coffee. The girls down at the office make better coffee on their hot plates. Well, see you later.
And he didn't even kiss me goodbye. If I could just make a decent cup of coffee, I could relax. So, relax. Why don't you try Instant Folgers? Tastes good as fresh perked. Good as fresh perked. I'll surprise Harvey for his birthday tonight.
Hey, great coffee.
It's Instant Folgers. Doesn't it taste good as fresh perked?
Better.
Better than those girls make at the office?
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
Instant Folgers taste good as fresh perked. Try it.
Harvey?
So from that, you can see that definitely reinforced that cult of domesticity, that conformity of being the good wife. Now, it's kind of hard to see this, but it's the Good Wife's Guide. Look it up if you ever get bored. But it's it's things that what you should do. It's never complain to your husband about anything because he already has, so much to worry about providing for the family. So don't complain to him because what he has going on in his mind is more important. It says, greet your husband when he comes home from work with his cocktail of choice already on hand. That kind of stuff. It's pretty crazy, but it was the thing back then. Next, just want to point out, in contrast to this cult of domesticity, Sloan Wilson actually wrote a novel called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, S-U-I-T. Okay. And this, we always hear about the struggle of a housewife and the conformity. Well, what about the men? I bet it was pretty stressful with men being breadwinners and this rat race of corporate America and keeping up with the Joneses. It's the wife's talking about how this so-and-so's husband just got a brand new car and and they want it too. And it's just the rat race, the frustrations, the stress of being, a father and a husband in the 1950s America. Okay. Also, I'm going to skip religion stuff, go to minorities. We talked about that white flight already. And there's a novel called The Invisible Man. It's not like the scary movie with Elizabeth Moss, but Ralph Ellison wrote The Invisible Man. And it's just a piece of evidence that it's about his struggle. It's like when all these white people just did the white flight and moved to the suburbs, it was like the African Americans are just left in the cities. And because everything's focusing on the new economics and industry of the suburbs, it's almost like the African Americans in the city are neglected or invisible. Okay, so that is it. Anything I've talked about Monday, Tuesday, or in this video can be on your quiz tomorrow.